Truths explode, revealing scandals that shake the world, while nations raise their voices demanding reparations for historic injustices that amount to billions. The weight of secrets kept for too long has finally begun to crack the polished surface of Traoré's life, a figure shrouded in mystery and influence whose actions, previously hidden in the shadows of deals and favors, have come to light abruptly, like an unexpected storm that reveals the fragility of structures that seemed unshakable, casting a long and disturbing shadow over everything he represented and everyone connected to him, unleashing a shockwave that quickly crossed borders. The exposure of this scandal, which is said to have deep roots and involve complex plots of power and money, was not just the downfall of an individual, but rather the opening of a Pandora's box containing uncomfortable truths about how certain circles work and how decisions, taken away from the public eye, can have devastating consequences, disrupting the lives of people in distant places and destabilizing delicate balances. The exact nature of the revelations surrounding Traoré remained partly unclear to many, but the sense of betrayal and the gravity of the accusations were palpable, fueling speculation and heated discussion in all corners, painting a picture of questionable operations and a distorted ethics that seemed to have permeated his activities for a long time, suggesting that what came to light was just the tip of a much larger and darker iceberg. For those who knew Traoré or were in some way connected to his ventures, the news was a devastating blow, generating a mixture of disbelief and resentment, as the figure who had previously inspired respect or fear was now synonymous with disappointment and dishonor, forcing them to confront the disturbing reality that the facade of success and respectability could, in fact, hide an intricate web of irregularities and morally flawed conduct, shaking confidence in the structures in which he operated. This sudden exposure of fragility in the pillars of power, where figures like Traoré had sailed with apparent impunity, served as a painful reminder that no matter how high one ascends, the truth has a persistent way of finding its way to the light, and the consequences of secret and damaging actions eventually take their toll, leaving in their wake not only personal ruin, but also a host of uncomfortable questions about the silent complicity or convenient ignorance of others. As the world watched the turmoil generated by the Traoré scandal, feeling the tremor of seemingly solid foundations, it was hard to see at first how this story of secrets and individual downfalls could resonate with the echoes of much larger and older struggles, connecting in unexpected ways with the cry for justice that was about to emerge from a nation on the African continent, demonstrating that what happens in one corner of the planet often has profound and unsuspected ramifications in others. Far from the center of the media hurricane that engulfed Traoré's figure, Zambia, a nation with a rich history and a resilient people that has faced countless challenges over the years, was preparing to make a bold and unprecedented declaration, a demand that would reverberate through the corridors of power in Europe and the United Kingdom, seeking to address the wounds of a colonial and post-colonial past that, according to the Zambian government, has left deep scars and a colossal financial deficit, limiting its potential for development and well-being for its citizens. This demand for billions was not a plea for aid or a loan, but rather a claim based on what Zambia saw as a historical and moral debt, the result of decades of economic exploitation, unequal trade agreements, and the appropriation of natural resources that benefited primarily colonial powers and later foreign corporations and individuals, leaving the African nation struggling to build a prosperous future on a fragile economic foundation, stripped of its own wealth. The courage required for a developing country to take such a stand against some of the world's most powerful economies is immense, and Zambia's decision to quantify the impact of this past exploitation in billions of dollars was a strategic move, aimed at forcing a dialogue on reparations and historical accountability in a tangible and unequivocal way, and highlighting the need to acknowledge that the development and prosperity of some nations has in part been built on the extraction and disadvantage of others. Behind the cold numbers of this multi-billion-dollar financial demand lies a deep human narrative of hardships faced by the Zambian people, of missed opportunities to generate wealth locally, of health and education systems that could have been significantly improved with the equitable use of their own resources, and of generations that have felt the weight of global economic structures that often seem to push the nation into a position of dependency and vulnerability, making this demand a cry for dignity and self-determination. The arguments presented by Zambia touched on sensitive points, raising uncomfortable questions about the legacy of colonialism and the continuing role that former colonial powers and their economic systems play in global dynamics, forcing a reassessment of the historical narrative and challenging the idea that the past is simply something to be forgotten, insisting instead that historical injustices have present consequences, and that reparations are not just a matter of retroactive justice, but also of creating a more just and equitable future for all. The initial response from the EU and the UK to this historic demand was, as expected, complex and nuanced, ranging from cautious acknowledgement of the need for dialogue to expressions of skepticism about the feasibility and precedents that such large-scale financial reparations could set. But Zambia, with its bold demand, had already achieved what many considered impossible, placing the issue of historic debt and economic reparations at the center of global attention, forcing a long-overdue conversation. As the Traoré scandal continued to unfold, revealing layers of secrecy and the downfall of an influential figure, and Zambia steadfastly pursued its billion-dollar lawsuit based on centuries of history and economic injustice, an unexpected and powerful connection began to emerge, linking the fate of one individual and his questionable actions to an entire nation's struggle for justice and redress, suggesting that the threads that weave the global tapestry are far more interconnected than they appear on the surface, and that corruption or exploitation on one level can have devastating echoes on another. It began to become clear that the same structures and systems that had perhaps allowed figures like Traoré to operate with little oversight or accountability, that had facilitated the accumulation of wealth through means that were now being questioned, or in many cases remnants or evolutions of the very mechanisms that had historically drained resources and created economic imbalances between the global north and south, making Traoré's downfall symptomatic of a larger systemic problem that Zambia was now trying to correct on a national scale. The emerging narrative was no longer just about a man and his secrets or a country and its historic debt, but about how a lack of transparency, the pursuit of profit at any cost, and legacies of unequal power continue to shape the world, and how the actions of individuals in positions of influence, even in seemingly isolated scandals, can be intrinsically linked to collective suffering and long-standing injustices faced by entire nations, revealing the depth of the consequences of unethical and exploitative behavior. Zambia's demand took on new emotional resonance in light of the Traoré scandal, as both events seemed to call for a reckoning. One at the personal level, demanding accountability for individual actions that caused harm and undermined trust, and the other at the national and international level, demanding that nations and institutions confront their role in systems that have enabled exploitation and accumulated wealth unequally over time, becoming two sides of the same coin of the need for justice and accountability in an interconnected world. The frustration and pain felt by the Zambian people at the slowness in acknowledging and remedying historical injustices was paralleled by the public outrage generated by the apparent impunity with which figures like Traoré were allowed to operate, creating fertile ground for solidarity and mutual understanding between different struggles for justice, highlighting that the quest for a more just and equitable world requires that both individual actions and systemic structures be examined and transformed, recognizing that the personal and the political, the individual and the national, are intrinsically linked. This unexpected convergence of events, Traoré's personal scandal and Zambia's bold demand for historical reparations, has forced a deeper reflection on the nature of power, wealth, and responsibility in a globalized world, asking who really benefits from the current system, who pays the price, and how we can collectively work to dismantle the structures that perpetuate inequality and injustice, inspiring a renewed call for transparency, ethics, and a genuine commitment to reparations and equity in all spheres, from individual business to international relations. The path to resolving Zambia's audacious demand for billions from the EU and UK, as well as the ultimate fallout from the scandal that exposed Traoré, remains uncertain and fraught with challenges, as dealing with the legacy of the past, especially when it involves huge sums of money and the reassessment of established historical narratives, is a complex and politically charged process that will require patience, negotiation, and above all, a genuine willingness to confront difficult truths and seek a path to reparation and reconciliation, recognizing that progress is often slow and requires persistence. The discussions between Zambia and the European powers are likely to be long and difficult, facing legal, economic, and diplomatic obstacles, as the idea of financial reparations of this magnitude raises complex questions about how to quantify the historical damage, who is responsible, and how to implement such a payment without creating unmanageable precedents. But the very fact that the conversation is happening, forced by Zambian determination, represents a significant step forward in a decades-long struggle to have history acknowledged and its consequences tangibly addressed. In parallel, Traoré's fate and the legal and social ramifications of his scandal will serve as a case study on individual responsibility and the effectiveness of oversight and justice systems in dealing with corruption and unethical behavior at high levels, showing whether exposing secrets will lead to real accountability and systemic change, or whether influence and power can still somehow mitigate the consequences, sending an important signal about how seriously the world takes breaches of trust in public and business figures. The interconnectedness of these two narratives, the personal and the national, underscores the continued need for vigilance and a global commitment to transparency and justice, as the Traoré scandal reminds us that individual integrity matters, and the Zambian lawsuit reminds us that history has a long reach, and that the structures of power and wealth we have inherited require constant scrutiny and ongoing reform to ensure that they benefit all, not just the few. As we watch these events unfold, we are reminded that the quest for a more just world is an ongoing journey that requires the courage to speak truth to power, the determination to right historical wrongs, and the resilience to persist even when the road is difficult. For the stories of individuals like Traoré and nations like Zambia are, at their core, chapters in a larger human narrative about the struggle for dignity, equity, and hope for a future where the shadows of the past no longer determine the fate of the present and the future. These stories, while specific, echo the calls for justice and accountability that are resonating in many parts of the world, inspiring reflection on our own role in building a more just and equitable global system, and inviting us to remain engaged and informed, recognizing that the fight for transparency, the redress of historical injustices, and the pursuit of individual and systemic accountability are integral parts of the collective journey towards a future where truth prevails and where the voices of all, especially those who have been marginalized by history, are finally heard and valued, and that ultimately, history teaches and inspires us to act so that such injustices are not repeated, building bridges of understanding and reparation where before there was only exploitation and silence. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring these profound narratives that shape our world. Leave a like to show us that this type of content resonates with you, and share your thoughts in the comments below, as your perspective enriches this important conversation we are having here.